Part 1. At Padnock's, Tyler Reed was practically invisible. His job kept him far from the spotlight, tucked away in a restricted research wing where he prepared tissue samples, monitored lab animals, and handled routine testing that few people ever noticed. He wasn't a scientist whose name appeared on patents or conference papers. He was simply another technician keeping the machinery of innovation running. But Tyler had ambitions that reached far beyond his job title. He wanted recognition. He wanted an opportunity to prove he was capable of more than carrying out orders. When fate finally presented that opportunity, he didn't hesitate. Only a handful of executives knew the company's greatest secret. Dr. Patricia Donahue, the visionary whose discoveries had transformed Padnock's into an industry giant, had suffered a devastating stroke. Officially, she was taking an extended leave of absence. In reality, she lay unconscious inside a heavily guarded medical laboratory, her body sustained by advanced life support systems. If the truth became public, investors would panic, competitors would circle, and Padnock's value could collapse overnight. Standing beside Patricia's medical chamber were Ray Underhill, a senior executive, and Dr. Hans Mason, the neurologist overseeing her care. The remarkable thing, Hans explained while studying the monitors, is that her brain remains incredibly active. The EEG readings show constant, complex neural activity. Her mind is still working even though her body can no longer respond. Ray stared through the glass. So, she's still in there? In a sense, yes. The stroke destroyed the pathways controlling movement, but it spared much of her memory and reasoning. Everything that made Patricia extraordinary may still exist inside her mind. Ray folded his arms. If that's true, can we retrieve it? Is there any way to access those memories? Transfer them into a computer? Preserve everything she knows? Hans gave a slow shake of his head. A direct brain-to-computer transfer remains beyond our current technology. But Patricia had been researching something different. What kind of research? A neural bridge between two human minds. Ray looked up sharply. Human to human? Hans nodded. She believed knowledge might one day be shared directly between compatible brains. She began the project years ago, perhaps realizing age would eventually limit her own abilities. She hoped that if the impossible ever happened, parts of her life's work could survive inside another person. Ray considered the implications. So, the process exists? In theory. And the risks? Hans answered without hesitation. Extreme. The transfer could permanently damage both participants. It could erase memories, destroy cognitive function, or kill them both. Silence settled across the room. At that moment, a young laboratory technician entered to replace an oxygen cylinder attached to Patricia's life support equipment. Hans and Ray exchanged a quiet glance. Neither needed to speak. They had reached the same conclusion. Tyler, Hans said calmly. The technician turned. Yes, doctor? You've worked here for several years. I have. And, because of your position, you've already become aware that Dr. Donahue is being treated here. Tyler nodded respectfully. Everyone who has worked with her knows how extraordinary she is. It's heartbreaking. Hans stepped closer. We may have a chance to preserve part of her brilliance. Tyler's eyes widened. There is an experimental procedure, Hans continued. It requires a healthy volunteer to establish a temporary neural connection with Patricia's brain. The technology has never been successfully completed, and the dangers are significant. Ray remained silent. What Hans didn't mention was that Tyler wasn't merely qualified. He was replaceable. Tyler hesitated only briefly. Are you saying I could actually experience some of her knowledge? Potentially, Hans replied. Even fragments of her understanding could change science forever. Tyler's pulse quickened. I earned a master's degree, he admitted, but compared to Dr. Donahue, I'm ordinary. If there's even a chance to learn from the greatest scientific mind of our generation. He looked once more at the woman lying motionless behind the glass. How could anyone refuse? Tyler swallowed hard before asking the question that mattered most. What exactly are the risks? Dr. Hans Mason didn't soften his answer. We're entering territory no one has successfully explored before. There are no guarantees and no reliable predictions. If you decide to participate, assume the outcome could be as bad as imaginable. That said, our priority will be protecting you. Without a healthy recipient, the entire experiment would be meaningless. Tyler stood quietly. He wasn't famous.
He wasn't wealthy.
His master's degree had earned him little more than a modest paycheck and a position hidden deep inside Padnox's research division. He understood enough neuroscience to appreciate just how impossible this project sounded, and just enough to realize that history often belonged to those willing to accept impossible risks. The chance to briefly connect with the greatest scientific mind of his generation was something no textbook could ever offer. "If I agree," Tyler asked, "I suppose there'll be paperwork?" Ray Underhill stepped forward with a practiced smile and extended his hand. The technical details escaped him, but one thing was perfectly clear. Patricia Donahue's knowledge represented billions of dollars in future discoveries. Losing it wasn't an option. "We'll handle every legal requirement," Ray assured him while shaking his hand. "Padnox will stand behind you. You'll be compensated appropriately, and every precaution will be taken to keep you safe." The documents arrived within hours. Medical waivers, confidentiality agreements, insurance forms, and emergency authorizations filled an entire folder. Tyler read every page before signing. By evening, he was back in his small apartment, unable to sleep as excitement and anxiety battled for control. The following morning, he returned before sunrise. Technicians fitted an advanced neural interface around his head, a flexible mesh containing nearly 200 precision sensors. Across the room, Patricia lay motionless while surgeons connected a matching array directly to implanted electrodes surrounding her damaged brain. Banks of monitors surrounded both patients. Hans adjusted the controls one final time. "Ready, Tyler?" Tyler inhaled deeply. "As ready as I'll ever be." Hans walked to Patricia's bedside and leaned close enough that only she could have heard him. "If any part of you is still listening," he whispered, "this is your chance. Share everything you can. Let your life's work survive." He activated the system. Immediately, the laboratory erupted with activity. Waveforms flooded the monitors. Neural signals surged across multiple displays. A digital map of Patricia's brain shifted from cool blues to bright yellows, then blazing orange before glowing an intense crimson. Hans had never seen activity like it. It looked less like a dying brain and more like one burning through every remaining reserve. He glanced toward Tyler. The young technician simply blinked. "How are you feeling?" Hans asked. Tyler frowned. "I don't know." A pause. "I feel irritated." "No, angry." Hans couldn't hide his smile. That sounded familiar. Patricia had always possessed a relentless drive, fueled by impatience with mediocrity. Even those closest to her knew that brilliance and frustration often lived side by side within her. The transfer was working. Gradually, the blazing colors on the monitor began to cool. Red faded into orange. Orange softened into yellow. Yellow slipped into green. At the same time, Patricia's body twitched. A warning tone echoed through the room. Hans shifted his attention to the vital signs monitor. Heart rate dropping. Blood pressure falling. Irregular rhythm. The numbers continued their slow decline. He knew there wasn't much time left. Her brain still flickered with isolated pockets of activity, but they were disappearing one by one. Hans turned back toward Tyler. Instead of looking inspired, the young man seemed distant, almost lost. Had they chosen the wrong volunteer? Perhaps Patricia's knowledge required a mind capable of interpreting it. Perhaps the information had arrived as meaningless noise. Or perhaps nothing had transferred at all. "Tyler," Hans called. "Anything?" For several long seconds there was only silence. Then Tyler suddenly looked toward an empty desk. "I need a tablet." Hans blinked. "A tablet? I've just solved something." Tyler sounded almost surprised by his own words. "If I don't write it down immediately, I'll lose it." A computer was rushed to him. His fingers flew across the keyboard with astonishing speed. Ideas poured onto the screen faster than anyone could read them. The words came effortlessly, each sentence leading naturally into the next. It wasn't merely fast typing. It was fast thinking. Hans watched in amazement before quietly returning to Patricia's bedside. "Thank you," he whispered. If she could still hear him, those would be the final words she would ever receive. Moments later, the monitors flattened. Dr. Patricia Donahue was gone.
Part 2.
Tyler continued typing without pause. Every formula, every theory, every observation seemed to arrive fully formed before his fingers could keep pace. He normally revised everything he wrote, but today there was no hesitation. Each sentence felt complete the moment it appeared. Something had changed. He wasn't a different person. He still remembered his childhood, his education, and every ordinary detail of his own life. But his mind worked differently. Problems unfolded into solutions almost instantly. Connections appeared where none had existed before. It was as though an entirely new level of reasoning had quietly unlocked inside him. Hans eventually approached. "It's over," he said softly. "Patricia passed away a few minutes ago." Tyler stopped typing. He walked slowly to the bedside. "I only knew her by reputation," he admitted. Seeing her in person was different. The years of relentless work had left their mark. Even in death, she looked physically drained, as though every ounce of strength had been spent pursuing discovery. Yet there were small details that caught his attention. Her fingernails had been carefully shaped and painted. Her eyebrows were precisely groomed. Dark mascara still framed her closed eyes. Although age had thinned her white hair, it remained long, carefully brushed, and gathered into a neat bun. For someone remembered primarily as a scientific genius, she had clearly cared about the way she presented herself. Tyler found himself studying those details longer than he expected, unsure why they suddenly seemed so significant. Tyler gave Patricia's lifeless body one final glance before speaking. "She devoted her life to science," he murmured. "But she also cared about appearances." It wasn't criticism, just an observation. Even after months in intensive care, traces of careful grooming remained. Someone who had reshaped the future had also taken pride in how she presented herself. A new thought suddenly surfaced. "I need to write something else down," Tyler said. "But first, I need a minute." Hans nodded approvingly.
Go.
"Don't ignore any ideas that come to you. Whatever you're experiencing, let it happen naturally. Based on what I've already seen, I'd say this experiment exceeded every expectation." The results had amazed even him. They hadn't merely recovered fragments of Patricia's research. They had preserved the way she solved problems. After Tyler left the room, Hans sat at the computer and carefully reviewed the notes. The concepts were elegant. Every equation flowed logically into the next. Every conclusion felt unmistakably Patricia's, except more complete. She had always been secretive, often keeping parts of her work locked inside her own mind until she was satisfied. This document contained none of those missing pieces. It represented years of research delivered with astonishing clarity. Hans immediately contacted Ray. "The procedure worked," he said. "And Patricia? We lost her." A long silence followed. Finally, Ray replied, "Then our responsibility shifts to Tyler. Whatever happened in that room has made him our most valuable asset. Patricia's apartment is vacant now. Offer it to him. He'll be safer and closer to the laboratory." "I was thinking the same. I'll handle the formalities surrounding Patricia's death." Meanwhile, Tyler stood alone inside the restroom, strangely unsettled. He instinctively walked toward one side of the room before abruptly stopping and changing direction, confused by his own actions. "What am I doing?" He couldn't explain why he'd hesitated. His thoughts were racing so quickly that simple decisions suddenly felt disconnected from instinct. After washing his hands, he looked into the mirror. The face staring back was unquestionably his own. Same sharp features, same slim build, same slightly tired eyes. Yet something felt different. Almost without thinking, he heard himself mutter, "That hair color really doesn't suit him." Tyler froze. Those weren't words he had consciously intended to say. He covered his mouth in surprise. Another idea immediately followed the first. Unlike the scientific breakthrough that had flooded his mind during the experiment, this thought was intensely personal. He leaned closer to the mirror. For the first time, he examined himself as though seeing a stranger. His face was youthful. His jaw wasn't especially broad. His frame was lean rather than muscular. His light brown hair had grown longer than most men preferred. There was nothing remarkable about his appearance. But suddenly, he found himself evaluating possibilities instead of facts. The realization unsettled him. When Tyler returned, he found Hans sitting at his workstation reviewing the notes. Normally, he wouldn't have minded. Today, irritation flashed through him before he consciously suppressed it. The feeling disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. Hans looked up. "This work is extraordinary." He smiled warmly. "I think you've earned a break. Go home, get some rest, and keep that tablet with you. If any more ideas come, write them down immediately." Tyler nodded. "I probably should." Hans stood. "Before you leave, there's something I'd like to show you." The two men crossed the building toward an elevator Tyler had never noticed before. Unlike the public lifts, this one was hidden behind an architectural wall and protected by a security keypad. Hans entered the access code. The doors opened onto a glass-enclosed skybridge suspended above the sprawling Padnock's headquarters. Beyond it stood a luxurious private residence built directly on the rooftop. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. A spacious terrace surrounded a quiet swimming pool. Elegant living spaces stretched beyond the entrance, along with guest suites and a private study. "This was Patricia's home," Hans explained. "No one else has lived here." Tyler slowly walked through the apartment. Books lined entire walls. Research journals covered the desks. Every room reflected decades of disciplined work. "There are still many of her belongings," Hans said. "If you choose to move in, we'll arrange for everything to be removed." Tyler immediately shook his head.
No.
Hans looked surprised. "I'd rather leave everything exactly as it is." "You would. Being surrounded by her work, it helps me think." He paused before quietly adding, "Strong roots allow great ideas to grow." Hans stopped walking. He had heard those exact words only once before. Patricia Donahue had repeated that phrase throughout her career. Tyler had never met her outside brief encounters in the laboratory. There was no reason he should know it. Yet he had spoken it naturally. Hans felt a chill run through him. Part 3. Hans arrived at Padnock's before dawn. Although he'd worked late into the night discussing Tyler's future with Ray, sleep had been impossible. The experiment had succeeded beyond expectation. Now came the harder challenge, understanding exactly what had changed. His thoughts were interrupted by an unexpected call from reception. "A woman is here asking to see you," the receptionist said. "Who is she?" "She says her name is Melody Talbot." Hans frowned. "I don't recognize it. She insists it's urgent." Curious, Hans agreed to meet her. Minutes later, a young woman entered his office. She appeared anxious but determined. "My name is Melody Talbot," she said. "I'm Tyler's girlfriend." Hans motioned toward a chair. "Tyler hasn't arrived yet." "I know." She took a steadying breath. "He called me this morning. Something's wrong." Hans remained silent. "I need you to tell me what happened yesterday." His expression hardened slightly. "I'm afraid I can't discuss confidential medical matters." Melody didn't back down. "I'm not asking about the experiment." She looked directly into his eyes. "I'm asking why the man who came home last night didn't feel like the Tyler I've known for years." Hans felt his stomach tighten. The possibility had crossed his mind. If Patricia's knowledge had transferred, had something else crossed over as well? Could a supervisor ever truly understand the people who worked beneath him? Hans wasn't sure. He knew Tyler as an employee, a capable technician with potential, but not as the person he became once he left the laboratory each evening. Melody, however, shared his everyday life. If anyone would recognize even the smallest change, it would be her. He called security. "Please escort Ms. Melody Talbot to my office. And tell her she can call me Hans." A few minutes later, she was shown inside. She looked exhausted. Dark circles framed her eyes, and worry was written across her face. Hans greeted her with a reassuring smile. Empathy wasn't something that came naturally to him, but today it seemed necessary. Melody didn't waste time with formalities. "I think you owe me an explanation," she said, her voice trembling. Because Tyler certainly isn't giving me one. Hans motioned for her to sit. What makes you say that? She took a deep breath. He's changed. She searched for the right words. He still looks like Tyler. He remembers everything. But he doesn't feel like the same person anymore. Hans folded his hands. Tyler is an important member of this organization, he replied carefully. Yesterday, he volunteered for an experimental cognitive enhancement program designed to improve problem-solving and analytical ability. Experiences like that can be mentally exhausting. We sent him home early to recover. Melody slowly shook her head. It's more than exhaustion. Tears gathered in her eyes. The man who came home last night wasn't the man I left that morning. Hans frowned. What happened? She hesitated. He told me he no longer feels comfortable living as a man. The words hung in the air. Hans blinked. I'm sorry, what? He said, he wants to live as a woman. Silence filled the office. He has never, not once, said anything remotely like that before. Whatever happened in your laboratory changed something fundamental. Hans struggled to process what he had just heard. Their goal had been to preserve Patricia's scientific knowledge. Nothing more. Her gender had never defined the way she worked. Patricia had devoted herself completely to research. She occasionally dressed elegantly for public appearances, but those moments were rare and never distracted from her work. He had admired her brilliance, not her appearance. Could fragments of personality transfer alongside memory? The possibility had never been seriously considered. Hans chose his words carefully. I'm not an expert in identity or psychology, he admitted. But changes like the one you're describing don't simply appear overnight. Is it possible Tyler had been questioning himself privately for some time? Melody answered immediately.
No.
Her voice was firm. He's always been reserved with everyone else, but never with me. We've shared everything. If he'd been struggling with something like this, I would have known. She leaned forward. This happened yesterday. Hans remained silent. He's impatient now. She looked down at her hands. And this morning he asked if he could borrow some of my clothes. For the first time since the experiment, genuine concern settled over Hans. Ray's repeated warning echoed in his mind. Risk. There had always been risks. Perhaps they simply hadn't imagined the right ones. Trying to calm the situation, Hans stood. Let me make us some tea. He prepared a blend he kept in the laboratory for long days of research. As they talked, Melody described the ordinary life she and Tyler had shared. Small routines, quiet evenings, weekend shopping trips, simple dinners. Hans listened politely. To him it sounded uneventful, almost painfully predictable. His own life revolved around science, conferences, and the laboratory. Relationships had always come second. Research had become both his career and his purpose. Their conversation ended abruptly when the laboratory door opened. Hans looked up and for a brief moment failed to recognize the newcomer. A young woman walked confidently into the research area. She wore a fitted black dress patterned with bright colors. Soft honey blonde hair rested on her shoulders in loose curls that shimmered beneath the laboratory lights. Without hesitation, she crossed the room to the coat rack. She selected Tyler's white lab coat as though it belonged to her. Sliding it over her shoulders, she casually swept her curls clear of the collar before fastening the buttons. Only then did she turn around. Her makeup was subtle, yet expertly applied. Neatly shaped eyebrows framed expressive green eyes highlighted with light eyeliner and natural-toned cosmetics. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who had spent considerable time perfecting a polished professional look. Hans stared in stunned silence. It wasn't simply because she looked different. It was the quiet confidence with which she carried herself. Only after several long seconds did recognition begin to settle. Somehow, against all expectation, the person standing in front of him was Tyler. Tyler stepped fully into the laboratory. A soft pink lipstick highlighted a confident smile unlike anything Hans had ever seen on the young technician's face. The voice that greeted him rested somewhere between masculine and feminine, still adjusting to its new rhythm. "I'm sorry I'm late, Hans," Tyler said with an easy smile. "I stopped at a salon this morning. I wanted my appearance to reflect how I truly feel." I probably should have called first. Hans could only stare. This wasn't simply Tyler wearing different clothes. Everything had changed. A carefully styled honey blonde hairstyle framed a face enhanced with subtle makeup. A fitted dress replaced the plain clothes Tyler usually wore. Even the confident posture felt unfamiliar. His gaze briefly dropped to smooth legs and open sandals with freshly painted toenails before returning to Tyler's face. The transformation was astonishing. Melody rose from her chair, tears already filling her eyes. Tyler. Tyler turned toward her gently. Melody, I didn't expect to see you here. She struggled to find the words. Why are you doing this? Tyler took a slow breath. This didn't begin yesterday, Tyler replied quietly. Yesterday simply gave me the clarity I'd been missing. Hans listened without interrupting. The neural procedure unlocked more than scientific ideas. It forced me to examine who I really am. I spent years ignoring parts of myself because they didn't fit the life I believed I was supposed to live. Tyler looked at Melody with genuine sadness. I know this hurts, and I'm sorry, but pretending would only hurt both of us even more. Melody wiped away another tear. So, this is really who you are? I believe it is. The laboratory fell silent. I still want to dedicate my life to research, Tyler continued. That hasn't changed. I still care about the work, the discoveries, and everything we accomplished yesterday. But I also want to live honestly. Turning toward Hans, Tyler added, if Patricia's apartment is available, I'd like to move in as soon as possible. Being close to the laboratory feels right. Hans remained speechless. For a fleeting moment, something in Tyler's expression reminded him of Patricia. Not her appearance, not even her voice. It was the unwavering confidence in her own decisions. The resemblance unsettled him. Part 4. Before yesterday, I was invisible. An overqualified laboratory assistant whose work mattered far more than anyone remembered my name. No one expected history to remember me. Then, everything changed. The experiment was supposed to preserve the knowledge of one extraordinary scientist. Instead, it reshaped my future. Whether what happened was neuroscience, coincidence, or something no one yet understands, I can't fully explain. What I do know is that after connecting with Patricia Donahue's mind, I began seeing both science and myself with remarkable clarity. Ideas that once seemed impossible now came naturally. Questions that had lingered unanswered suddenly made perfect sense. At the same time, I found the courage to acknowledge feelings I had spent years pushing aside. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living according to everyone else's expectations. I was living according to my own. The person looking back at me in the mirror finally felt familiar. I decided to keep my name, changing it only slightly to reflect the beginning of a new chapter. The laboratory remained my home. Research remained my passion. But my life no longer revolved solely around work. I wanted to experience the world beyond equations and experiments, to build relationships, appreciate beauty, and embrace opportunities one had never allowed myself before. Hans treated me with patience throughout every stage of that transition. Perhaps he sometimes saw echoes of Patricia in the way I approached problems or spoke with quiet certainty. Perhaps that was inevitable after everything we had experienced together. Whether fragments of Patricia truly survived within me, or whether the procedure simply awakened something that had always been there, is a question neither science nor philosophy can answer with certainty. What matters is this. One experiment changed far more than anyone intended. It preserved remarkable knowledge. It transformed an ordinary life. And it proved that sometimes the greatest discoveries are not about changing the world. They are about finally discovering yourself.